So that you don't have to figure it out for yourself, I'll bluntly admit that I, Tom Collins, my parents had a sense of humor, am a weird guy. Perhaps the strangest aspect of my life is that I am a jack of all trades and good at almost nothing. For example, I got really into Houdini magic, like freeing myself from handcuffs, straitjackets, holding my breath underwater, etc. I was pretty good at it, and as a teenager I even gave a few performances, until I nearly drowned, which stopped me. I trained to become an MMA fighter and won 3 fights against low-level opponents, honing in on a few select holds, kicks, and punches. Then I faced a mid-level fighter, but it didn't work out and I quit MMA. I did row-gaining, long-distance cross-country orienteering, which involves both route planning and navigation, and participated in several competitions. I performed well in regular competitions, but when I fell off a cliff, fortunately without serious injury during a higher-level competition, I gave that up too. I developed a fascination with pistols. When I was 18, I acquired 3 guns through not entirely legal means, went to a shooting range, and actually got pretty good with all 3, as well as a few other shooters at the range. My dad, he's a prosecutor, found out about the 3 guns, confiscated them, and turned them over to the police as part of a no-questions-asked surrender program. Fortunately, my academic life was a little different from the activities described above. Although I dropped out of French after 2 years of high school and avoided social studies courses as best I could, I was actually stellar in math and science. I studied those courses diligently without interruption and ended up graduating with honors from a good engineering school. I never had a problem getting dates with attractive women. However, my personal life was messed up not because I left, but because I was dumped. A month before graduation, I was unceremoniously dumped by my longtime college friend Brittany. I don't even know if it was because of another guy, because she never explained it to me. She basically told me, life isn't fair, get over it. At least she did it in person and not via text. It really hurt because I was convinced she was the love of my life, and I, apparently naively, thought she felt the same way. My future wife Melissa and I were both on the rebound when we met shortly after graduating from college the same year. Although Melissa wasn't completely honest about her situation, from what she told me, her scenario was similar to mine. She thought Peter was the love of her life, but a few days before graduation she was told, though apparently he took it more nicely than Brittany did, that he was moving to Europe for work and not inviting her along because there was no hope of a long-term relationship. The 2 resentful puppies that Melissa and I were when we met were obviously desperate to salvage our egos and dreams. We thought our instant connection was true love, not something transient that would eventually make us both wonder if we were settling down instead of satisfying our romantic aspirations. There was a lot about her during our courtship that I didn't like, and I'm sure she didn't like the least about me. But I was able to justify or rationalize it in my mind because I so desperately wanted our relationship to work out. Sex with Melissa was good, though not on the same level as with Brittany, but I tried hard. It wasn't until 4 years after we were married, when I sought out psychologist Susan Fields, that she set things straight and gave me, too late, the advice I should have gotten after Brittany, but before Melissa. Tom, the ability to compromise is a sign of a good relationship. However, if you justify or rationalize many things about the person you're in a relationship with, which was exactly my situation, especially suboptimal sex, then you're settling for something that won't last long. Or even if it lasts longer than expected, you will never be happy. Many people fear that they'll end up alone, so they stay with someone they don't trust. Don't make excuses. Walk away and find someone who doesn't require you to explain yourself. It's not that Melissa and I were nasty to each other or treated each other badly, except for a few months after we met, but before we were married, there just wasn't any spark between us. Even after 5 years together, we only had 3 serious arguments, all about the same thing. The arguments that Melissa and I had were about the attention given to other people, Harmon Major in Melissa's case, Colleen Fleming in my case. Our first fight occurred when I thought that not only was Harmon giving Melissa too much attention, but that she seemed to be taking that attention. After a fierce confrontation, we calmed down, and after a couple of subsequent confrontations between Melissa and Harmon that weren't as unpleasant for me, we seemed to be back to normal. The second altercation occurred when Melissa said the same things about me and Colleen that I thought about her and Harmon. Again, we calmed down after a few days, and after the next few encounters between me and Colleen weren't as unpleasant for Melissa, things were fine. The third argument was a repeat of the first two when we both expressed concern at the same time, me about Harmon and her about Colleen. We resolved the issue more quickly and with more enthusiasm than the first two. There was one major difference between the way I looked at Harmon and the way Melissa looked at Colleen. I thought Harmon was a total jerk and had no way of understanding how any woman could like him because he was large, belligerent, and unassuming from a male perspective, but several women I knew seemed to like his looks, whereas Melissa liked Colleen. I was just struck by her attractive looks. Did I mention Colleen was a hottie? The third argument happened over 6 months ago, before my story even started. Melissa worked as the head computer librarian at a small private college in our town. She almost never traveled for business. I worked as an energy resources engineer. I had knowledge of oil, natural gas, coal, peat, wind, solar, tidal, hydro, and geothermal energy, although I was not an expert in any of the fields. I conducted an initial assessment for my employer, Enerzit, a large international corporation. I conducted a preliminary assessment in geographic areas, after reviewing all relevant physical data about them, and based on my assessments, Enerzit sent experts to the energy areas I had noted. I have been very successful in my work and, at the time of this writing, have never been wrong in my initial assessments. I traveled on business more often than I would have liked, but never stayed longer than a week. I enjoyed the very work I was doing for Enerzit. Much less enjoyable was having to deal with the problematic and competitive personalities of some of my co-workers. Harmon Major also worked for Enerzit, but in accounting, so at least I didn't usually have to deal with that asshole at work. There were plenty of other assholes, though. Perhaps the biggest asshole was Eric Magnum, who would probably run over his grandmother to advance his career, and unfortunately, I occasionally had to interact with Eric. I was sent to do an assessment in Mindanao, the second largest island in the Philippines, which was about 94,630 square kilometers. Unfortunately, at the time, asshole Magnum was conducting operations in the Far East. I researched not only the usual physical aspects of the area, such as topography, satellite photos, wind speed, ocean currents, river flow, average temperatures, and average solar insolation, but also the political climate. I was very concerned about the fact that Islamic terrorists, known as Abu Sayyaf, known to kidnap people from the West, were operating in the area. Eric assured me that there would be no problem with them, as they had not been active in the area I was traveling to for some time, and that he would hire private security to escort me. Although I was apprehensive, I went with them, primarily because I had to. The private guards hired by Eric struck me as somewhat unreliable. The commander of the six-man group, however, spoke decent English and seemed professional, even though his men were motley. The commander had the unusual name Alab al-Balorio, and he told me that he lived in Davao, the largest city in Mindanao. I'd only been doing my assessments for about 48 hours when the disaster occurred. As I was measuring solar insolation, we were approached by a group of half a dozen rough-looking guys with AK-47 assault rifles, two of whom belonged to a rare breed of Filipino men. They had beards. The bearded leader and Alab were talking. I didn't understand the language, but I made out the word Magnum, which was uttered several times. The leaders exchanged handshakes, and my bodyguards simply left, taking my gear. In poor English, the uninvited guests introduced themselves as Abu Sayyaf, and, as if I hadn't already realized it, said I was their hostage. I walked with my captors through the rainforest for about 6 hours with only a few breaks before we came to an area with a ramshackle house and a couple of outbuildings. I was placed in one of the outbuildings and shackled. Fortunately, my captors were not the smartest people in the world, and their search was unsuccessful. They confiscated my wallet and cell phone, but they didn't find the mini tool bag I kept in my left sock, which contained small tools needed to adjust and repair the sophisticated solar insolation measurement equipment I was using. I realized that I could be killed at any moment and that I would likely fare poorly and gradually lose my strength, so I planned to gather information over the next couple of days to try and remove the shackles with the tools from my mini bag. using my skills as a teenage mage. My plan was accelerated when around midnight on my first night in captivity, 3 terrorists opened the door of the hut, pushed a woman inside, and shackled her a few meters away from me. As soon as they left, I struck up a conversation with the woman. I couldn't get a good look at her in the meager light in which terrorists usually entered the cabin, but she was tall, blonde, and obviously a Westerner. "I'm Tom Collins, and what's your name?" was my brilliant opening sentence as soon as the terrorists left. "Monique, do you speak English?" was her reply, followed by, "How do you feel about talking about love?" which was about as close as I remembered from high school French to being asked if I spoke French. Her English was about as bad as my French, but thanks to the odd combination of the 2 languages, we could actually communicate well enough to understand each other. She was originally from rural France, but she had been discovered by a Parisian talent agent and had been modeling, not in fashion, as she was too sensual for that, but in cars, yachts, and just about everything else but clothes, in Paris for a few months. Her modeling career was not successful, but she was rediscovered by a Saudi sheikh, and in retrospect, she foolishly fell in love with him and married him. After the marriage, his true penchant for control became apparent, and she tried to dissolve the marriage by fleeing to several different countries, eventually the Philippines. She was convinced that her husband had tracked her down and was responsible for her capture by Abu Sayyaf. We sympathized with each other for about an hour and then fell asleep. I didn't tell her that I could free myself from our shackles, but I told her that I thought we could escape. When I woke up and saw light streaming into our cabin, Monique was already awake. It was the first time I got a proper look at her. Damn it! She was an even more attractive version of Colleen Fleming, the woman my wife was jealous of and for whom I had repressed a passion within me. When we had slept for about an hour, 2 terrorists entered our hut and treated us to a modest breakfast of a small amount of rice with a small amount of overripe mango. The second terrorist was new to me, and I didn't like the way he looked at Monique, and she liked it even less. After we ate, I told Monique that we needed to leave as soon as possible. I opened my leg irons and was about to release her when we heard a noise. The disgusting-looking terrorist had returned, and it was obvious he had devious plans for Monique as he picked her up. It was game time. As the terrorist was walking out the door, pushing Monique in front of him from whom he had removed the leg irons, I jumped up and threw the chain from my handcuffs around his neck like a boa constrictor. I was much bigger and stronger than he was, and by the time he decided to grab his gun rather than try to rip the chain off his neck, it was too late. I shook him to make sure he was dead, and then gestured for Monique to come back to the cabin. We found the shackle key in his pocket, which made it easier for us to remove the handcuffs. We took out a few Philippine pesos and his gun from his pockets, as well as a knife in a sheath on his belt. I examined the gun and made sure it was familiar to me. It was an M1911 pistol, usually issued to soldiers in the Philippines who have pistols, and probably taken from a dead soldier. Although I had never owned a pistol, I had used the M1911 pistol at a shooting range I frequented when I was 18 years old. I put the grip and thumb safeties in the active position, told Monique we had to deal with the terrorists in the dilapidated house since we had no chance of escaping them if they quickly realized we had escaped, and she followed me. Fortunately, there were only 4 terrorists in the dilapidated house, and all in one room. The rest were in the woods, probably trying to kidnap others or lure the soldiers into an ambush. I caught them off guard and shot them all with my stolen M1911 before they could fire their weapons. Monique and I searched through all their belongings. We found 2 old but perfectly usable backpacks, American dollars, pesos, and credit cards, which they confiscated from Monique and me. Our passports, the water filter bottle they had taken from Monique, a compass, something that looked like food rations, a couple of dirty but sturdy blankets, and 5 guns. I disabled the AK-47 as best I could, as well as one of the pistols because I wasn't familiar with it and didn't know if I could handle it properly. I inserted small sticks into the barrel of each machine gun and then poured some dirt into the barrel. I left the free ends of the barrels clean, hoping the terrorists wouldn't see what I had done. Fire the guns and they would be killed or wounded. Fortunately, the other 4 guns I found were M1911S and had plenty of ammo for them. We couldn't find our cell phones. I gave Monique the lighter backpack, one of the M1911 pistols, with which I gave her a short training course, and a knife, while I took the heavier backpack with 3 M1911 pistols and lots of ammo, and slipped the last pistol behind my belt. After that, we hit the road. The largest city, Davao, was in the south, and the remaining terrorists were expected to head there, so we headed north, deep into the rainforest. We really couldn't trust the local population, as we had no idea who Abu Sayyaf's sympathizers were or if there would be any reward for us, so we planned to lay low for a while. Besides, Monique was scared to death that her husband had connections, and now he could kill her on the spot if we ran into the wrong person. When we stopped for lunch on the first day and both took a swim in a nearby creek, it was the first time I really got a good look at Monique. I used to think she was an enlarged copy of Colleen, but she didn't hesitate to take a nude bath. So now I got a really good look at her. In my opinion, Monique was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Although her face was not classically beautiful, it was very open, sympathetic, and pleasant, and her body could inspire poets and sculptors. She was 180 centimeters tall, only 10 centimeters shorter than my height of 190 centimeters, and weighed 65 kilograms. She had a perfect ass, sculpted thighs, a slim waist, wide biceps, and large breasts. She noticed me looking at her and smiled. In half French, half English, she asked if I had seen a naked woman before. My answer, also in Sergic, was, "And not half as beautiful as you." She liked that a lot. Monique and I quickly got used to living off the land and finding places to spread our blankets to avoid insects and other critters. Even faster, we got used to living with each other. Although Monique probably didn't feel as instantly attracted to me as I did to her, after a few days it became obvious that she was almost as much in love with me as I was with her. She often called me my sweetheart, followed by a kiss on the cheek, which inevitably made me blush. On the 6th night of our escape, everything changed. Monique made her intentions clear. She pulled her blanket close to mine and, as I translated her words, asked, "Don't you find me attractive, Tom? You haven't tried to fuck me yet, and here I am in your power." I looked her in the eye and replied, "I don't want you. I want to make love to you. You're everything I want to see in a woman. Bold, smart, fun, and incomparably sexy. I don't want to miss my chance at a long-term relationship with you by being overly persistent. Tell you what, let's sleep together now, then make love and see what happens next." She smiled at me. In a second, I went from a pensive state to an energetic one. After that night, we couldn't get enough of each other. Our passion was helped by the fact that we were able to trade one of our guns for a double hammock, which we rarely used. It took some time to get used to the hammock, but once we did, sex became really exciting, unusual, and full of adventure. We slept and made love at least once a day. Sometimes we managed to get a room in a rickety, rustic hotel where we destroyed more than one bed as they were not designed for large people like us. After 3 weeks, we both realized we were extending our stay in the wilderness mainly to stay together because we were in love with each other. Although we were both still paranoid about what her husband and my colleague had planned for us if we returned. We had dozens of extreme situations during our time in the rainforest. We worked well together as a team, overcame all obstacles, and actually, I believe, and the tone of our bodies confirms my confidence, got as fit as we had been our entire lives, with the possible exception of the time I trained for MMA. During our 4 months in the wilderness, things changed. Monique started throwing up almost every morning, but she wasn't sick or eating junk food. When Monique threw up for the 4th time, she took my hand and said, "You know what that means, don't you?" By then, I spoke French pretty well, and she spoke English, so we talked in one language or another. "It means you're probably 6 weeks pregnant," I smiled back. "What do you think about that, Tom?" "I couldn't be happier, Monique. I'm determined to live the rest of my life with you, and the thought of us having children makes my toes tingle with happiness." With Monique pregnant, it was time to return to civilization and to find out the details of how and why we had both been handed over to Abu Sayyaf. The first stop in these endeavors was to find a decent hotel in Davao, contact the embassies of England and France. eventually contacting my parents and Monica's parents and finding Alba Albalorio. After stealing a car, we drove from the rainforest to Davao, bought groceries and cell phones at the store using my credit card the first time since we'd escaped, and took a long, hot shower together. I shaved off my facial vegetation for the first time in months and shaved Monique's legs and armpits. Once we were both almost hair-free, we made love all night on the comfortable hotel bed. After a full day of rest after our sleepless night, I went to meet with a private investigator from England while Monique scoured the internet trying to find out where her husband, with whom she was living separately, might be and what he was doing, as well as any other information about both of us. Fortunately, without leaving his office, thanks to Alba's unusual name, an English private investigator was able to quickly find his residential address. I asked the private investigator to find out current information about Eric Magnum and then set out to find Alab. I was indeed lucky, as I followed Alab's house that night. He was coming back half drunk from a bar when I grabbed him and stabbed him. He lived alone in a shitty first-floor apartment, so I took the keys out of his pants pocket, unlocked the door, tied him to a chair, and splashed water in his face until he woke up. When he opened his eyes, I put a knife to his throat. "Remember me, Alab? Tom Collins, the guy you gave up to Abu Sayyaf." Alab started babbling like a fly, trying to justify himself. I told him to shut up and just answer my questions, and that if he wasn't honest, I would kill him. Since only his head and shoulders were in view of my cell phone camera, I videotaped it and started interrogating him. He was scared to death and very outgoing. I got all the information I needed from the interrogation, as well as from emails and text messages saved on his phone, which I transferred to mine, and from a document in his possession, which was an affidavit he had signed 2 months earlier, claiming that I was swimming in the ocean on the day he actually handed me over to Abu Sayyaf. He witnessed me being dragged underwater by a sea crocodile, and he never saw me again. What was particularly poignant was that Magnum ordered him to kill me, but he had the brilliant idea of handing me over to Abu Sayyaf, who would eventually sell me into the white slavery market. I didn't really think such a thing existed, but maybe it really did, since Abu Sayyaf knew they couldn't sell me to Enerzit, and it seemed like the only way for them to make money off me. Once I had gotten all the information I needed from Alab, the question of what to do with him came up. Since he had unwittingly saved my life, I didn't want to just kill him. It was for this purpose that I bought some sleeping pills at the drugstore and found some anti-Duterte literature on the internet. I drugged Alab, stuffed his pockets with anti-Duterte literature, and a small amount of a potent substance that looked like cocaine to me. I dumped him in front of the police station. When I got back to the hotel, I excitedly told Monica what I had discovered, and she responded in kind. She had found many newspaper clippings describing the deaths we had both suffered. Fortunately, we hadn't contacted our parents yet. We had to approach them with caution. She had also learned that her husband had disappeared from sight. We weren't sure what to do about it. The next day, we bought first-class airplane tickets. Our passports were still valid, even though we were presumed dead, and called both sets of parents. Apparently, Monique's mother had passed out while on the phone, but her father was nearby and was able to help her and talk to Monique. I dialed my father's work phone number. Although he was shocked but happy, thankfully he didn't pass out and said he would make sure to inform my mother. I asked him to wire some cash for me to a local bank, and within an hour he had transferred $8,000 to the bank account I had specified. The reason we were flying to Los Angeles was because Eric Magnum had been transferred there. While Monique stayed at the hotel planning the rest of our trip, I visited Magnum after hours in his office. My Enerzit ID was still working at the night security guard behind the counter in the lobby. I wasn't as nice to Eric as I had been to Alab. I broke his nose and left cheekbone with my right elbow, and after he fell to the floor, I crushed his balls. He wasn't unconscious, but I wish he had been. I told him all I knew and explained what he was going to do about it. In my presence and on speakerphone, Eric called the CEO of Enerzit on the CEO's personal cell phone, which is strictly forbidden except in emergencies, although I certainly thought my problem was just that. He admitted to the CEO that the security officers he had hired to protect me were actually supposed to kill me, and emailed the CEO documents confirming his actions and pointing to Harman Mahor as his accomplice. The CEO that same evening asked him to email his resignation letter. The CEO was going to call Harmon immediately and fire him, but I asked him to wait 3 or 4 days because I had some other things to do, and the CEO agreed. Harmon apparently planned this whole scenario by bribing Magnum and making him believe, using forged documents, that I was going to replace him in the Enerzite hierarchy. Harmon's obvious motive was to get Melissa. I had plans for Harmon. As soon as Eric's resignation letter was sent, I tied him to a chair with electrical wires, attached a "hook me up" sign to his desk recorder. I had already recorded the conversation with the CEO myself on my cell phone. I called the local FBI office and informed them that he was dealing with terrorists and kidnapping. I waited right in front of the office building for the few minutes it took for 4 FBI agents to enter the building and then left. Early the next morning, Monique and I left the hotel, renting a car to go to Las Vegas. From Vegas, we flew east to my hometown. I called ahead of time to make Monique's appointment with the OB-GYN. When I got back to my hometown, I rented a car, we checked into the hotel, and I took a cab to take Monique to her doctor's appointment. I headed to my former home. There was a car in the driveway that I recognized as Harmon's car, and a smile appeared on my lips. The front door was locked, but I pulled a key from our usual hiding place and entered the house. Melissa saw me and fainted. Fortunately, I was close enough to pick her up and lay her gently on the living room rug. And then my fondest hopes came true. Harmon entered the living room from the kitchen. Harmon is larger than me and perhaps even stronger, but I had 3 advantages: surprise, anger bordering on controlled rage, and my MMA skills, which I had continued to practice over the years and never lost. Harmon lay unconscious on the ground less than a minute later, at which point I did my best to smash his balls by kicking him with my leather boots with pointed toes. Once I was done with Harmon, I gently woke Melissa up. She went through a period of anguish, tears, sighs, and expressions of disbelief before she pulled herself together. Finally, she was able to ask questions. "I can't believe you're alive, Tom. I've seen affidavits from several people in the Philippines who swear you were eaten by a crocodile. There's a trial being finalized right now where you'll be officially declared dead. How did you survive?" "Unfortunately, you and I are both victims of that asshole Harmon," I grinned. "What?" she exclaimed, covering her mouth with her hand. When a look of horror appeared on her face, I explained to her how Harmon had conspired with Magnum to kill me, though the alleged killer had instead handed me over to Abu Sayyaf. She began nervously twirling the ring on the ring finger of her left hand. I noticed it. It was not the wedding ring I had given her when we got engaged almost 6 years ago, nor was my ring on her. The ring combined with the expression on her face caught me off guard. "What kind of ring is that?" I asked, trying to be as non-confrontational as possible. After much sobbing, Melissa finally answered me. "I thought you were dead. Harmon and I are engaged. It took Melissa 3 tries before I could make out what she said next through her tears. She was 8 weeks pregnant, and she was having Harmon's baby. Looking back, I always wondered what my reaction would have been if I hadn't been in love with Monique, and if she probably, I'll find out after today's visit to her doctor, wasn't 8 weeks pregnant with my baby either. However, since that was the situation, I was able to remain calm and contemplative. I assured Melissa that everything would work out, although I had no reason to be as sure of that as I put it. I then made sure she was comfortable and called the FBI. 3 agents arrived at my house within the next 45 minutes. I explained how Harmon had ordered my kidnapping to eventually kill and steal my wife, how he attacked me when I got home and I defended myself, how he consorted with terrorists, and how he was a threat to national security. I emailed the lead agent all the information I had. While I was talking to the FBI agents, Monique called. She was in high spirits. The appointment had gone very well. She was 8 weeks pregnant. All of her and the baby's vital signs were normal. I told her to take a cab to the local FBI office and meet me there, as the agents wanted a full report. As I walked out of my house and poor Melissa waved me goodbye, 2 EMTs and a couple of local cops were carrying Harmon away on a stretcher. I wasn't sure how things would work out, but one thing I knew for sure was that I was going to spend the rest of the days of the rest of our lives with Monique. Monique and I spent most of the next 3 days at the local FBI office, but we spent our nights alternately making love in a nearby hotel with an FBI guard standing outside our door. I hope he wasn't listening too closely to her screams and my grunts. I also spent some time on the phone from the FBI office with the CEO of Everzeet and negotiating my financial well-being while Monique was visited by other government officials who we were both convinced were from the CIA, although they never openly identified themselves as such. Many interesting facts came to light. Harmon had arranged with Everzeet to pay Melissa $500,000 on a life insurance policy provided by the company, even though I had not yet been officially declared dead. The independent insurance company on my $1.5 million policy refused to pay the claim until a court decision, which now, of course, will never take place. Although Melissa was in no way implicated in Harmon's machinations, she felt a tremendous sense of guilt that led her to admit that she had had an affair with Harmon 2 months before my abduction. The CIA was very interested in what Monique could reveal about her husband, his associates, and his business. Apparently, what Monique and almost everyone else outside the U.S. and allied governments didn't know, her husband Ashar was suspected of having terrorist ties, and apparently the information Monique had helped the CIA identify them. By the time our 3 days of interrogations were over, we were convinced that Ashar was on a terrorism watch list and would never be allowed to enter the U.S. without arrest. Everzeet was willing to fully compensate me, approximately $2 million, for my suffering without any legal action. In fact, a promotion was available to me, with much less travel, if I chose to return, which I could do at any time over the next 6 months. I also got them to agree to leave Melissa $500,000, even though it would have been part of our divorce agreement. I was honest with Melissa about Monique and even arranged for them to meet. I was as kind as I could be in letting her know that she and I were divorcing. It was no surprise to her. She knew we couldn't stay married since she would be carrying Harmon's baby. Monique and I hired a cool international family law attorney who, with generous compensation, was able to get Monique's divorce from Ashar around the same time that my divorce from Melissa was final, and before our little girl was born. Monique and I also married as soon as the divorce was finalized in the presence of both parents, and again before the birth of our baby girl, whom we eventually named Colette. Magnum and Harmon both ended up in federal prison, receiving sentences ranging from 22 to 30 years in prison. Melissa gave the boy she had with Harmon up for adoption. It had been 8 years since Monique and I had gotten married. The CIA has expedited Monique's application for citizenship because they want her around to testify if they ever get her ex-husband to stand trial in the U.S. We have a second daughter, Amelie. Both daughters are tall for their age, speak French, better than me, and English, better than Monique, and are a source of light in our lives. I have my own consulting firm. I am happy in business and very content with my family life. Monique teaches French part-time as a volunteer at the elementary school where our children attend, and does other charitable work in the community when the children are in school. Right now, I am experiencing something opposite of settling in my marriage. I guess you could call it a mixture of contentment and ecstasy. I am no longer in touch with Melissa, but I have heard rumors that she got married a few years ago, and I hope it is time for her to settle down as well.